Talking about chaos theory as it relates to Jurassic Park is a big enough topic that I feel we should take it on its own for the moment. To discuss this, we first need a better understanding of what chaos in this context is. The film gives us the simple example of water dropping onto Ellie's hand and not necessarily heading in the same direction. And that can provide a small insight, but let's get into what chaos theory says. Imagine for a moment that we're on the highway. The road sign says that we're 35 miles from our destination. You ask me how fast we're going, and I tell you we're going 70 mph. You can quickly conclude then that we're about a half an hour from our destination. Obvious stuff, right? So why bring it up? Because one of the first things to note about chaos theory is what's called sensitivity to initial conditions, colloquially referred to as the butterfly effect, although the example is sometimes misunderstood. To demonstrate, I've created this graph in Excel. Yeah, a spreadsheet. Try not to break your mouse heading for the subscribe button. Part of the reason I'm doing this, though, is that I can throw less math at you by showing you my graph here. If you want a real discussion of the mathematics, there are better videos out there than that. This is just trying to show you the basics. What I have here is a very simple function. It's f of x equals 4x times the quantity of 1 minus x. What I'm doing is feeding the results back into it again every time. That's what's called an iterative function. So this shows the changes over time, like firing a cannonball and knowing second by second where the ball is based on the data from where it was a second before. I'm starting with x as 0.904508497, my lucky number. And as you can see, we get this sawtooth graph. Now, nothing terribly remarkable, but the number that I'm using isn't exactly 0.904508497. The number is actually the quantity of 5 plus the square root of 5 divided by 8. Excel is just rounding the display here for you to the nearest billionth. Now let me emphasize that. Billionth. That's a number so small that the entire human population of the Earth will increase by a billionth in the time that it takes me to say billionth. So, here's where all this starts to matter. Watch what happens to the graph when I round this number to the nearest billionth. Things are good for a little while, but soon they fly completely out of control, don't they? Even being as close as a billionth isn't good enough for what we call nonlinear equations. That's why sensitivity to initial conditions is a criteria, because it turns logic on its head. With the car journey, you didn't have precision measurements. You don't know exactly how far it is to your destination. Is it 35 miles from where the sign is pounded into the ground, or from where you can see the sign from, or something else entirely? Nor do you know if I'm actually going at 70. Maybe I'm actually going at 71 or 69.5. It doesn't matter because approximate was good enough. About 35 miles at about 70 miles per hour means about a half an hour. Chaos theory doesn't work that way. Close is just never close enough. So, normal systems, approximate measurement yields approximate results. Chaotic systems, approximate measurements do not lead to approximate results. Sensitivity to initial conditions isn't the only requirement for chaos theory, but it's an important point to grasp, because we're not talking about interference in the system. We're not talking about the unpredictable changing things. A simple underlying framework leads to wildly unpredictable results, and in the reverse, a seemingly wild mess demonstrates orderly effects. In the film, Ian name-checks strange attractors and phase space, which helps to show this. Professor Ian Stewart gives a great example of how strange attractors work. Imagine a roiling sea during a storm. The water's surface is turbulent. That's chaos. Now imagine a ping pong ball in the sea. A ping pong ball is too light to sink, but it's too heavy to just hover in the air. So no matter where it is, it will be drawn towards the surface of the water. Tossed up out of the sea, it'll fall back to the surface. Plunged under the crashing waves, it'll float up to the surface. It's not stationary, but it's always drawn towards the same state. Mapping out these possibilities of how the system will behave is where phase space comes in, which can show the interaction between interrelated things, like an island with both goats and velociraptors on it. Too many velociraptors, the goats will all die off, and then the velociraptors will starve to death. Not enough velociraptors, and the goat population will grow too large for the island to be able to support. There's a relationship between them. Likewise, if you look at the weather in terms of wind speed, temperature, and humidity, you see the interrelation between them in phase space. When Lorentz did this, it gave the famous shape that looks like a butterfly, thanks to the two strange attractors. So chaos isn't a case of shrugging our shoulders like it's your bitter grandpa shouting at strangers from the porch. It's just old chaos. What can you do about it? There is much more to it than that. There's still a mathematical foundation to it. While the unpredictable can be the result of these complex interactions, when we talk about sensitivity to initial conditions, we're not talking about interference or about something unpredictable just leaping in and changing things. Some people misunderstand the meaning of the butterfly in the butterfly effect, thinking that it's about something interfering in the way things would have gone otherwise. The butterfly is affecting the precision of your initial measurements. That's the way that it applies when we talk about it in terms of chaos theory. It's the difference between me putting a brick in your backpack at the start of a race versus me hurling a brick at you during the race. You can normally win because you know your endurance and the weight of your pack, but you lost because your backpack was actually heavier than that. Whereas in the second case, everyone will clearly know you lost because some spreadsheet-using jerk hurled a brick at you. The difference here, though, is important because it says that chaos is not the result of flying bricks, and that's what we see in Jurassic Park. Ian repeatedly asserts that chaos theory will doom the island to fail, even going so far as to claim that he didn't imagine it could happen, he calculated it would happen. Many of these things are not calculable, though, merely unforeseeable. The Dilophosaurs are poisonous and spit venom, something previously unknown. The velociraptors have intelligence at the level of chimpanzees. T-Rex stays hidden because it gets sunburned. Stegosaurus has gizzard stones, which cause them to accidentally swallow poisonous berries. Some things you could expect, like the consequence of these animals being displaced in time means that the oxygen is too thin, but that displacement also has led to the bacteria that consumes the herbivore's feces being extinct, and that some dinosaurs are susceptible to a skin fungus that hadn't existed in the time. Those are all examples of Crichton's common theme, that no matter how careful you are, you can't plan for everything. And they are all indicators that the park has to deal with the unexpected. But remember that just because something is unexpected doesn't mean that it's chaos. To be sure, the park does have plenty of evidence of chaos on display. Where to even begin? How about the bugs in the computer system that are inexplicable? Feeding systems are on a 12-hour instead of 24-hour timer. The parasite detector for fecal matter is getting a false positive, and so on. Computers have so much self-referencing code, it's a perfect model for chaos emerging. Plus, as Mr. Arnold notes, they have all the issues that a major theme park has to deal with. Maintenance, repairs, trash disposal, and so on. Plus all the problems that a major zoo has to deal with. Animal care, safety, etc. All being overseen by a man whose primary concern is money. Okay, so doesn't this prove Ian right then? Things are not going the way that they were intended, after all. Well, a lot of this is perfectly in keeping with chaos theory. Unexpected consequences from minor events. If you say that the intention is that this island was never really under absolute control, defined as everything is operating precisely as the park administrators intend, well, then that would be a fair argument. But the fall of Jurassic Park has nothing to do with that. Nor of chaos theory, for that matter. It is the result of an unrelated outside element. Nedry turning off systems so that he can steal embryos. Ian's points are about the island as a system. To suggest that he could calculate that the park's computer programmer would compromise the system for industrial espionage would be absurd. Nedry is not a minor event. Nedry is a thrown brick. Chaos theory may predict that an engine will fail due to design flaws, but chaos theory will not predict that an engine will fail simply because someone could break it with a sledgehammer. Or to put it another way, evolution might predict that the Tyrannosaurus would die out if the climate changed, but it would not predict that an asteroid would hit the planet and do that. It's a common mistake to assume that chaos is related to randomness, but they're not the same. There's a huge difference between our inability to predict long-term weather and our inability to predict the lottery. To be fair, one could interpret the Malcolm effect as essentially being that once something goes wrong, the problem will rapidly get beyond all control. So while it didn't predict that the park would collapse into anarchy, it did predict that once overall control was lost, that regaining it would be impossible. Mr. Arnold's argument is that Ian doesn't realize the ideas that convinced him that the park would collapse are an inexorable part of a living system. That it's not a bug, it's a feature. There's something to be said for that. Modern fighter jets are deliberately designed in a way that commercial ones are not, with the instability ready to spiral out of control, but always kept fully stable by constant minor adjustments from the plane's computer. This allows the jet to be far more maneuverable. Instability kept stable can actually be beneficial. It's just that Hammond's miserliness hasn't left them with the means to restore stability if it was ever lost. Both men are right in different ways. Perfect control isn't necessary, except that Hammond has created a park in such a way that it cannot function without perfection. All faith was put into static systems without backing it up with fluid systems. As stated, one of the 4 leading causes of death in surgery is the unexpected, but that does not mean that the unexpected will always result in death. It merely means that generally one is not prepared for the unlikely. Atul Gawande, the surgeon that I mentioned while discussing the Andromeda strain, recounts the story of nicking the vena cava during a routine surgery of the adrenal gland, an unexpected complication which caused what one could consider a Malcolm effect, the patient bleeding out into his abdomen and his heart stopping almost immediately. Yet adequate preparation, they wound up putting 30 units of blood into the patient's body over the course of the surgery, allowed the patient to survive, with only partial blindness in one eye as the result. So what would be a more accurate interpretation of what Malcolm determined wasn't that the park would fail, but rather that it would A, suffer some form of catastrophic failure, and B, did not have sufficient resources in place to attempt to correct said failure. As Professor York, the one who named chaos theory, says, "My rule of thumb is that those who are most successful are good at Plan B."